folks, today I'm so delighted to have our guest, Neeraj. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. So I know that you've been to so many countries, right? So how many countries have you been to, like for work purpose?
Well, I would say somewhere around 40 different countries over the last 25 years.
40, wow. So which country are you most like impressed or surprised?
Well, every country has a slightly different culture and different experiences you will have.
Yeah.
I'm still very impressed with Singapore. That's where I live. And
Now,
there's a reason
now
I
I'm going
live
to
there.
give you a very difficult task then. So
Sure.
since Singapore is where you're from and where you're living right now, so I'm just going to let you use 3 keywords to describe the country. My students will do the same. So, and then we will compare. Do any of them, they have exactly 3 keywords?
Sure. I would say the best 3 words: efficient, safe, cosmopolitan.
Oh, wow. Why those 3 keywords?
Well, the 1 and 2 make the 3. So Singapore has, if you are familiar with the history of Singapore, they have built the country in a way that it's one of the most efficient places in the world, whether it's living there or traveling around in terms of logistics. They have one of the best airlines in the world. So extremely efficient. The system works and works seamlessly. It's very safe for the families, for people to live. It's extremely safe. And when you put these two together, the efficiency and the safety, that's what really makes Singapore as one of the cosmopolitan cities for Asia, where most of the people who do work across the region and have a regional job want to live in Singapore.
That's true.
So 1 and 2 make the 3 happen.
Yeah, I guess I wonder how many of you guys got the exactly 3 keywords. So Singapore, by nature, it is international, right? As you talk about, it's the hub, right, for Asia and also kind of the bridge for Europe, right? So, and it's like so international in so many dimensions. So Doing Business Index has been ranked Singapore as the most easiest for doing business for so many years, right? So based on your perspective and your experience, why having international perspective is so important?
I think the world is more and more intermingled. If you think about any business, any of the different industries, over the last 25, 30 years, we've seen a lot more of the world getting closer. When you think about whether it's the flow of capital, flow of goods, and flow of people, it becomes a lot more important today than maybe 50 years ago to have a good international perspective, because no matter where you go in terms of your work, you will be dealing with people from different parts of the world in your organization. And you might be working in different parts of the world. So it really becomes critical for people to have a good international perspective and understanding of how things work in different parts.
That's so interesting. So you talk about connectedness in different dimensions, right? People, right? So people travel around, and then goods like products, right? So imports, exports. And then you also talk about people, and then also perspective, right? So this is exactly the 4 dimensions we talk in our class about global connectiveness. So among the 4 dimensions, which one do you think are actually today starting to become more challenging for people? Because we're starting to see some like skepticism about globalization. There are some like, political uncertainties and some of the regulations, right? Or deregulations. So among the 4 dimensions, what do you think is like more important, and what are the 4 dimensions we feel like we're starting to see a little bit, drawbacks?
So let me start first on your point about globalization versus deglobalization. Over the last 50 years or so, we have seen, in fact, a significant change in terms of what you define as globalization, more connectedness in the world with regards to the flow of capital, goods, people, and everything. I don't think we are going to go for deglobalization because that's an opposite of everybody going inwards. I think we might see a new world order, which you would probably define as the globalization phase 2 or re-globalization, where because of geopolitics, because of the regulations, and to some extent the policies from the governments in different countries, I do expect some shifts happening in terms of how businesses are done, how the supply of goods happen. You obviously listen to a lot of the noise around the reshoring, friendshoring, onshoring. end of the day, the world still needs the goods and services to be produced for the different countries. So there will be some rejigging of all that. So all the perspectives you touched on from a global connectedness standpoint, I don't think they will change. But yes, the kind of obviously globalization we saw in the last 3 decades will not look similar in the next 3.
Sure, sure. Yeah, so I totally agree with you. So we cannot really reverse some of the impact of globalization we saw in the past decade, right? But there might be a new normal, which means there are going to be multi-pillar competition. And then there are some potential threats, but also some opportunities.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's going to be like new challenges for firms who basically competing in different geographic locations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You'll see that. And in fact, you might see a little bit more of regionalization for building resilience in supply chains, a very topical point around all the boards, because obviously COVID taught us something that you can't really have just-in-time supply chains in very dispersed parts of the world all the time. So that resilience will have some impact. The challenges in terms of geopolitics will have some impact. So there will be a rewiring. There's no doubt about it. But that rewiring will create significant opportunities when you think about the changes in supply chain and changes in the flow of capital.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing some of that.
Right. So speaking of change of capital, I know that you had career in, asset management and divestment, right? So what's your perspective about the future trend, either, some positive opportunities or maybe some threats for this industry overall?
So overall, we are living through probably one of the most complicated and fascinating times in the industry. If I take a step back, there are multiple mega forces which are really shaping how things evolve from here. And to just name a few, you have the globalization rewiring. Obviously, that's linked to the geopolitics. You have the shift in terms of the inflation and the interest rates, which means the cost of capital has shifted higher.
Yeah.
You have artificial intelligence and you have decarbonization.
Right.
Now, all of these will have implications in terms of how you think about investing long term, but things like the globalization rewiring is creating investment opportunities in the new places with regards to the supply chain. The decarbonization is a huge focus for the world because the world cannot afford not to move towards the net zero. The timing is going to be the debate. We'll have COP28 soon and you will see more debate coming out of that. But I don't think the direction of travel is the discussion of or the debate here. It's more of the pace. So I do think it creates the cost of capital, and the bank regulations are creating some pressure on the system that you've seen maybe 20 years ago and been a while for a lot of people who joined the industry after 2008 crisis.
Yeah.
They gotten used to the idea of rates being zero in the developed markets and the capital flows to be abundant. I think that's shifting. So you are seeing interesting opportunities, obviously, in terms of how you invest. You have to beat the cost of cash, which is very different today than what it was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And then regulations are also creating gaps in the markets, which are going to actually push the growth of areas like private credit, which was a small space 10 years ago, much stronger, much higher as you look forward next 5 to 10 years.
Right. That is amazing. You mentioned a couple of very important trends for global economy, right? So I know that the world, we're just having more regulations in so many dimensions, which add another layer of complexity for firms, particularly firms, they land in different geographical locations because the regulations are not all aligned, right? So, different country may have different agenda, particularly in terms of deglobalization. Although we have this Paris Agreement, we all know that carbon neutral is the goal. But different country, they have their different implementation, right? So based on your industry insights, what do firms do? How do they dance around this complexity of regulation?
So first of all, regulation is a very broad topic. Obviously, when we look at regulation from the financial sector, a lot of it is the regulations around the financial sector, the banks, and what that means. Then obviously you have the idea of regulations, and maybe more broader than that, the policy making from the government side. When you talk about things like the decarbonization and the net zero. Now that's, I think, a critical topic. And I do believe as we go into the COP28 in a couple of weeks' time in the Middle East, there will be a lot more discussion. And I'll be surprised if there is disagreement around the direction of travel. I think the bigger discussion or debate at this point is the pace of travel. Now, can we get to net zero by 2050? I think that's going to be debate. Is 1.5 degrees going to be the peak? That's going to be a debate. How do regulations and in fact the policy making from the government side is stronger to move towards the decarbonization effort, because that's critical for the world. I don't think the world can afford not to move in that direction.
Sure.
But the pace of it, to your point, is not exactly the same right now in different parts of the world. Every country is doing different milestones from a net zero perspective. And the last thing I would say is obviously the governments will continue on that path, but it also comes down to the corporates and the organizations to play their role and for individuals to play their role in terms of making a difference with regards to the decarbonization efforts that world is actually going towards right now.
Right. Speaking of individual role, Singapore is well known for being super clean. We have a lot of plants in the country, right? So individual citizen, they have strong, sustainability awareness, right? So what are the things that we have done in Singapore? Do you think, other country or maybe they can learn from it? Is that model kind of exportable to other places?
So Singapore, one unique feature of Singapore is that it's a small island, and you can
people
manage.
always say that as an island.
It is an island, and it's also an island which is very, very well managed. And hence, when you think about the policy and the policy implementation, you have to give credit to the government that it's actually very forward-looking policy making and very clear articulation of that policy and a very good implementation. So all the way from design to implementation, it's done extremely well. And it is very top-down when it comes to the decarbonization from the government standpoint to actually to put those targets in place. And then you do see both at the corporate level, a number of companies in Singapore are embracing their own part in terms of that implementation. And lastly, people. Now, people have to play a role. End of the day, what we are living through is because of a combination of the growth in population and the need to, in fact, support that population, which has led to the global warming.
Right.
So people do have to play a role. So that awareness that and the policies the governments create become quite an important part of people's own awareness and what the efforts they put in, whether it's in terms of keeping the city green, using public transport. So Singapore has spent a significant amount of time, effort and capital in actually enhancing the public transport system.
Right.
All those add up when you think about the effort.
You're right. So you basically either top down or bottom up. So it seems like you describe both situations.
It converges, and the best way to actually get something done is through that convergence, where there is a policy that's clearly articulated and implemented, and you have people who are working towards that because they understand it.
What is your typical day routine like?
So it is if I'm not traveling. So I'll put that caveat because when I travel, everything goes for a 6.
Yeah.
But when I'm not traveling, my day starts early in the morning with actually looking at the markets, what happens overnight.
Yeah.
And there's a simple reason for it. No matter where you live in the world, if you are in the investment management industry, what happens in the US markets across bond, equities, FX will matter for your market the next day.
Right.
So I start with that. Then I spend a little bit of time clearing my important emails. Given you get 500 emails, you can't clear all of those in the morning. And then my day normally is split in 3 broad parts, and that's part of my job responsibility. The first is investment, which is the first meeting of the morning. It's focusing on markets, portfolios, positioning, risk, etc. And that continues through the day, a lot of those discussions. The second part is around the people management, which is an absolutely critical part of being a manager. So obviously I have to make sure that I spend enough time with the team on the people management aspect or anything related to that. And the third is around the business part of it, where I spend some time looking at whether it's internal aspects with regards to business or meeting clients. I do spend a lot of time traveling across the world or within Singapore meeting clients on a regular basis. So between the 3, the day is always running short on you. And then obviously to make life very, very interesting, given we have our headquarters in New York.
Yeah.
I live a day in two parts. I have the Asia day and then I have the New York day, which means that once New York starts to come in around 7:30 p.m. Asia time, I'm back to some of the work in terms of coordination with my global colleagues.
Sure. I like how you start with the news. I always tell my students, you need to form a habit so that every day pick up New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, just read through the news. And then in my research, we find whenever there's a major event, you see the stock market changes, right? So that reflects stakeholder, shareholder in particularly, people's perception and about the certain policy, right? So, but today we have a lot of information. No lack of information, right? And also the different sources of information. Can you give my students some advice about the efficiency? Speaking of efficiency of reading the news, making sense of the news, and also efficiency in interpreting the news.
Sure. So the first thing I would say, which is critical in any job, in investments, the first most important thing is you'll always remain a student of the markets. So for anyone who thinks that you graduate and get a job and you're done with studying and learning, it's different. You absolutely have to keep learning and sometimes unlearn and relearn in this job.
Yep.
And that's obviously a critical part of your long-term journey. To your point in terms of how do you learn, I would say there are three, I would put it in three broad buckets, and I try to do all three. One is the longer term views and what's happening in the world, and even to some extent thinking through the management theories and other things. I do try to read a lot of books. And I find it fascinating because a number of times when you read a book, it might have 5 to 10 years of research that goes into one book.
Sure.
And you can spend a day actually getting through all of that. So that's the first.
Yeah.
The second is your source of regular news flow, which I spend a lot of time on Bloomberg or some of the common newspapers you can imagine.
Sure.
And you would look through that literally every day and becomes a habit.
Yeah.
And the third part is more specific to the investments and the portfolios. There's obviously a lot of information flow that comes in from all the different sell-side advisors, the different parts of the world. And that's where the trick is in terms of the efficiency, because you have to filter the noise from what's important. And I don't know if there's an easy way. It comes with experience. So if I get 500 emails and I can look at the names, I know that 10% of those are useful, 90%. I can quickly look through if it needs an action. If it doesn't, you don't need to spend a lot of time.
Right.
But that ability to filter the information pushed through your email and other channels, it becomes really important. And as you spend more time on it, you get better at it.